Years after the Duke's death, a letter arrived in her name, and his handwriting shook her soul. The drawing room at Ashmore Manor held the quality of a tomb, not in decay, but in the profound absence of sound. Dust motes drifted through the November light, turning the air itself into something visible, something that seemed to carry the weight of 4 years of collective mourning. Elowen Vale sat near the window, her moss-green eyes fixed upon the garden beyond, where the elms stood bare and skeletal against a colourless sky. Her posture was composed, as always, spine straight, hands folded upon a well-worn copy of Blackwood's magazine, but there was something about the tightness at the corners of her mouth that suggested an internal struggle she did not permit herself to voice aloud. The letter had arrived that morning. Even now, 3 hours after the post had been delivered, Elowen could feel its weight upon the mahogany table beside her, though she had not yet opened it. The envelope bore her name in ink that was unmistakable, bold, deliberate, formed by a hand she had last seen 4 years ago, tracing mathematical calculations upon a leather-bound journal in the Duke's private study. A knock sounded at the door. Elowen did not turn. "Miss Vale?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, and it carried a particular uncertainty, the tone one adopted when delivering news that might wound. "There is a caller. Lady Brackmore requests your presence in the front parlour." Elowen's hand tightened imperceptibly upon the magazine's edge. Lady Brackmore, widow of the late Duke's cousin, had made a habit of these surprise visits since Thorne Avelgard's death. They were not, Elowen understood, visits of kindness. "Please inform her ladyship that I shall be present momentarily," Elowen replied, and her voice held the trained gentleness of a woman long accustomed to concealing her true sentiments beneath layers of propriety. She rose slowly, smoothing the folds of her grey wool gown, a gown deliberately chosen to signal mourning respect, though she wore black only partially, a subtle refusal to declare herself a widow, in fact. The letter remained upon the table. She would not bring it downstairs. That would be an invitation for scrutiny she was not prepared to endure. The parlour was cold. Lady Brackmore sat upon the edge of a settee, as though she might at any moment discover the furniture was unworthy of her form. She was a woman of approximately 50 years, with the kind of beauty that derives from severity. Sharp cheekbones, thin lips habitually set in an expression of moral judgment, eyes the colour of flint. Her black gown was impeccable. Her widow's weeds were a uniform she wore as though they had been tailored by God himself. "Miss Vale," she said, not rising, "you look well, for someone in reduced circumstances." "You are kind to say so, Lady Brackmore." Elowen took the seat opposite, maintaining the distance propriety demanded. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" "Pleasure?" A thin smile crossed the older woman's face. "How you exaggerate, dear. I have come on a matter of estate business. It has been brought to my attention by the solicitors, you understand, that there are certain effects of my late cousin that remain in this house. Personal correspondence, effects of a private nature. I have come to ensure that all materials pertaining to the ducal estate are properly catalogued and returned to Avelgard House." The implication hung in the air like a blade suspended above still water. Elowen understood perfectly. Lady Brackmore was searching for something. Letters, perhaps. Evidence of impropriety, should any exist. "All such materials were surrendered to the solicitors immediately upon the Duke's passing," Elowen said quietly. "You may verify this with them, should you wish." "Indeed." Lady Brackmore rose, moving toward the window with the deliberate grace of a woman performing righteousness. "Yet I am told you have been permitted to remain in this cottage, to maintain a position here, despite being neither relation nor servant to the ducal house. One might wonder at the generosity of such an arrangement. One might even wonder—" She paused, allowing the silence to deepen, "at the circumstances that warranted it." Elowen felt her breath catch, but she did not allow it to show upon her face. The letter upstairs seemed to pulse with presence, as though it might burst through the floorboards and announce itself. "My position here was arranged by the Duke himself before his death," Elowen said, each word carefully measured. "I serve as an educator to Mira, and as a cataloguer of the estate's historical materials. This arrangement has been maintained by the trustees in accordance with His Grace's final wishes." "Yes," Lady Brackmore said, turning back with an expression of such calculated pity that Elowen had to suppress a shudder. "The child. How touching that he maintained such an interest in her welfare. Though I confess, Miss Vale, I have always wondered at the nature of his interest in you. A man of his station attending so carefully to the education of a woman of no particular family, no fortune, no consequence." The silence that followed was suffused with implication, the unspoken accusation that such interest could not possibly be innocent, that Elowen must be either delusional or disreputable. "His Grace was a patron of scholarship," Elowen replied, her voice steady though her heart had begun to race. "My father's antiquarian work was known to him. He valued the cultivation of knowledge in those who possessed aptitude for it, regardless of their station." "How convenient that his values were so liberal," Lady Brackmore said softly, "and how fortunate that you have inherited the benefit of his charity. One hopes you are appropriately grateful." The barb had been well aimed. Elowen rose, a gesture that signaled the end of the visit, though propriety required she disguise it as courtesy. "I am indeed grateful, Lady Brackmore, grateful for His Grace's kindness, and grateful for your concern regarding the estate's affairs. But I assure you all matters have been conducted with absolute propriety." As Lady Brackmore gathered her things, her gloves, her reticule, her expression of veiled triumph, she paused at the threshold. "Do ensure that any materials that come into your possession are reported to the solicitors with utmost promptness, Miss Vale. The estate must be settled completely. We cannot have loose ends. We cannot have rumours." When the door closed behind her, Elowen remained standing in the cold parlour, her hands trembling slightly. She smoothed the folds of her sleeve, a gesture of control, a moment of fortification. Upstairs, the letter waited. And within that envelope, in the unmistakable handwriting of a man 4 years dead, lay something that would irrevocably alter everything Lady Brackmore sought to control. Elowen moved toward the stairs. The letter lay before her upon the writing desk in her small private chamber, a room that had been granted to her through the Duke's generosity, overlooking the same garden she had gazed upon from the drawing-room. The envelope was cream-coloured, expensive, sealed not with wax but with a simple fold. Upon it, in that unmistakable hand, lay her name, Miss Elowen Vale. She had stared at it for nearly an hour. The rational portion of her mind, the portion trained in scholarship, in logic, in the observation of natural phenomena, insisted upon impossibility. Thorn Avelgard had been dead for 4 years. The funeral had been well documented. His grave in the family chapel bore his name, the dates of his life and death inscribed in granite with the finality of absolute truth. She had attended the service herself, standing at a respectful distance as protocol demanded, watching his brother, now the current Duke, receive the condolences of the assembled gentry. And yet, the handwriting before her was absolutely, unquestionably his. She had seen his hand countless times, in the margins of books he had gifted her, in notes left for her father during their scholarly correspondences, in the formal documents she had helped catalogue from his personal library. There was no mistake. No forgery could have captured that particular slant, that deliberate pressure upon the pen, the slightly archaic form of the E in her name, precisely as he had always written it. Her fingers trembled as they approached the envelope. She did not permit herself to think of what this might mean. To do so would be to invite madness, or a hope so dangerous that it could only result in profound disappointment. She broke the seal. Within was a single page, folded. The paper bore the faint scent of his study, something between leather-bound books and the particular tobacco he had favoured. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The letter was brief, not the lengthy correspondence of a man with much to say, but rather the concise communication of a man who had chosen his words with the precision of someone who knows he will not have opportunity for revision. "My dearest Miss Vale, if this reaches you, then the arrangements I have made have proven adequate to their purpose. I write this knowing that 4 years may have passed, or perhaps more. Time, I have found, is irrelevant to what I must confess. What matters is truth, and truth, I believe, cannot remain eternal prisoner to propriety. I have been a coward, not in the matters of the estate, not in the conduct of my duties, but in the matter of my heart. I have permitted fear of scandal, concern for your reputation, and my own damnable pride to prevent me from speaking what ought to have been said years ago. You are the finest soul it has been my privilege to encounter. Your mind is extraordinary, not merely because you possess understanding in excess of most of your sex, but because you employ that understanding in service of truth and kindness. Your courage, which you disguise beneath studied modesty, has become the measure by which I have learned to value honor itself. I have been unworthy of your regard. I have carried the roughness of a man untamed, unsuited by temperament and circumstance to be worthy of your affection. But I have loved you, I do love you, and I shall love you beyond whatever threshold death may present. You must not mourn for me, dear one. Nor should you permit the world to dictate the value of what passed between us. What we shared, in conversation, in intellectual companionship, in the unspoken understanding that sometimes passes between two souls, was real, it was pure, it was enough. Forgive me that I lacked the courage to declare it whilst I yet drew breath, but know this, you have altered the course of my life. You have made me a better man. And should you ever doubt your own worth, should the world ever succeed in convincing you that you are lesser than you are, I ask you to remember this letter. Remember that there was one man of rank, of consequence, of the world's particular standards, who saw you truly and deemed you worthy beyond all measure. Yours in eternal regard, T.A. Elowen read the letter 3 times. On the first reading, she could not comprehend its meaning. On the second, she understood it but could not believe it. On the third, she permitted herself the luxury of feeling. The tears came not as violent sobs, but as a quiet, profound release. The kind of weeping that belongs to a heart suddenly granted permission to acknowledge what it has always known. She pressed the letter to her chest, pressing the paper against her heart, as though she might somehow draw the writer himself through the veil that separated the living from the departed. "Oh, Thorn," she whispered, his name a prayer upon her lips, the first time she had dared to speak it aloud in his absence. "Why did you not speak? Why did you not tell me?" But she knew the answer. She had always known it. His reticence was his nature. A man of action who found words to be insufficient vessels for genuine feeling. His silence had been his protection, and perhaps hers as well. Had he spoken whilst living, she would have been destroyed. The world would have destroyed her. A woman of no fortune, no family of consequence, could never hope to hold the affection of a duke without inviting complete ruin. And yet he had found a way. From beyond death itself, he had found a way to reach her, to tell her the truth that propriety had demanded he withhold. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Elowen quickly folded the letter and concealed it within the bodice of her gown, composing her expression into careful neutrality. "Enter," she called. It was Mira, young Mira Quilby, the ward of the estate, a girl of 12 years with bright, intelligent eyes that missed very little. She wore a simple blue gown, her dark hair arranged in a neat braid, and she carried a worn copy of David Copperfield that Elowen had been reading aloud to her. "Miss Vale, I have finished my Latin composition," the girl announced, holding out a sheaf of paper. "And I thought perhaps we might continue with Dickens. I confess I am most eager to discover what becomes of David." Elowen smiled despite her emotional turmoil, a smile that was perhaps more tender than usual. "Of course, dear child. Let us sit together. I should very much like to lose myself in a story for a while." As Mira settled beside her, chattering happily about her Latin, Elowen found herself acutely aware of the letter hidden against her heart. The girl had been born during the final months of the Duke's life. She had known him only briefly, yet Elowen understood that Thorn had cared for Mira with genuine affection. He had ensured her education, her safety, her future, and now, through this letter, he had ensured that Elowen would not be alone, that she would have knowledge of his love to sustain her through whatever trials might come. The letter pulsed with warmth against her skin, a secret she could not yet share, a truth she barely dared acknowledge. She opened the book and began to read, her voice steady even as her heart sang beneath the surface of her careful composure. It was Mira who discovered it, as Elowen had perhaps somehow known she would. The girl had ventured into the estate's library, a privilege she had been granted because of her scholarly inclinations, in search of a particular volume on natural history. Instead, she had found something far more remarkable, a wooden writing tablet, ancient in appearance, its surface bearing grooves and indentations that suggested long use and careful handling. "Miss Vale, come quickly," Mira's voice carried from the library, edged with excitement and something akin to urgency. "I have found the most curious thing." Elowen's breath caught. She had known the tablet existed, had seen it once in the Duke's study years ago. He had shown it to her briefly, explaining that it was a habit tablet, a device used for daily calculations, mathematics, and private notes, with a wax surface that could be smoothed clean and reused. He had mentioned it only once, and she had thought no more of it. Until now. She found Mira in the library's eastern alcove, kneeling beside a low shelf that had been forgotten in the general cataloguing of the estate's materials. The tablet lay across the girl's palms, and she was examining it with the kind of careful attention that marked a true scholar. "It belongs to the Duke, does it not?" Mira asked, looking up with suspicious brightness. "I have never seen you examine it before. Yet your hand trembles as you look upon it now. Children, Elowen reflected, possessed an unfortunate talent for observation. It is indeed the Duke's, she said carefully, taking the tablet and settling into a nearby chair. He was a man of considerable intellectual appetite. He used this device for calculations and temporary notes. But look, Mira urged, moving closer. Upon the wax surface, do you see? There are marks, indentations, that have been pressed so deeply that they have left permanent grooves. Someone has written upon this tablet with considerable pressure. And see here, she pointed to a sequence of letters that had been carved into the wax with such force that they had achieved a kind of permanence. These marks have not been smoothed away. They were preserved deliberately. Elowen's hands stilled. She had not examined the tablet closely in her previous encounter with it. The letters carved into the wax were small, but unmistakably deliberate, and as she traced them with the tip of her finger, feeling the grooves beneath her skin, she understood. The impressions spelled out fragments of words, phrases that she now recognized from the letter hidden against her heart. Truth cannot remain eternal prisoner to propriety. The words had been pressed into the tablet so forcefully that they had created permanent records, grooves that no smoothing of wax could erase. This is evidence, Elowen whispered, understanding flooding through her. This is proof. Proof of what? Mira asked innocently, yet there was intelligence in her question, a recognition that whatever lay before them was significant. Elowen could not answer directly. To speak the truth aloud would be to invite ruin. Instead, she gathered the tablet to her chest, holding it as though it were a living thing, a direct connection to a hand now stilled in death. "Thank you, dear child," she said softly. "Thank you for your remarkable powers of observation. This is a private matter, but you have done well in bringing it to my notice." That evening, when Mira had gone to bed and the household had settled into sleep, Elowen lit a lamp in her chamber and examined the tablet in its light. The grooves were indeed permanent, testimony to the force with which they had been inscribed. She could picture Thorn in his study, pressing the stylus so firmly that he had virtually carved his words into the wax itself, ensuring that they could not be erased, not by accident or design. It was a message in itself. I cannot erase this. I cannot pretend it does not exist. She thought of Lady Brackmore's visit, of the woman's thin-lipped insinuations, of her desire to control the narrative of the Duke's life and death, and she thought of Thorn, who had found a way, even in death, to leave behind physical evidence that could not be denied, could not be explained away as delusion or impropriety. The letter spoke to her heart. The tablet spoke to the world. Together, they formed a truth that could no longer be suppressed. Elowen held both artifacts close, the paper against her skin, the tablet against her palm, and made a silent vow. She would not hide what he had left for her, not forever. When the moment came, when the truth could no longer be concealed, she would speak. She would claim the reality of what had passed between them. She would not permit his love, nor her own, to be erased by propriety or scandal. Outside her window, the November wind moved through the bare branches of the elms, sounding almost like whispers, almost like voices from another world, confirming what she now held in her hands. He had loved her, and that love had crossed every boundary, including the ultimate boundary between life and death. The letter from Mr. Harrington, the estate's solicitor, arrived on a Tuesday morning when the frost lay thick upon the garden and the air itself seemed to carry a particular weight. Elowen stood in the entrance hall, the envelope in her hands, feeling her pulse quicken at the formal script that bore her name. She had been summoned to his offices in the village, a summons that was both extraordinary and deeply troubling. Women of her station did not receive summons from solicitors. Such communications were the domain of family members, of heirs, of those who possessed legal standing. She knew with absolute certainty what this must concern. The solicitor's office was situated above the apothecary's shop, and it carried the particular chill of rooms that existed primarily for the transaction of business rather than comfort. Mr. Harrington was a man of approximately 60 years, with silver hair and the careful demeanor of someone long accustomed to delivering information that others would prefer not to receive. He rose as she entered, offering a bow that was respectful but not obsequious, the precise degree of courtesy extended to a woman whose station was ambiguous. "Miss Vale," he said, gesturing toward a chair positioned before his desk, "I am grateful that you received my letter. This matter requires discretion, and I confess I was uncertain of the appropriate method of approaching you." Elowen settled into the chair, arranging her grey skirts with deliberate care, employing the gesture to ground herself. "You have my complete attention, Mr. Harrington. Might I inquire as to the nature of this meeting?" The solicitor exchanged a glance with his clerk, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. He rose and moved to a cabinet behind his desk, withdrawing from it a leather portfolio bound with red ribbon. He placed it upon the desk between them with the gravity of a man handling sacred objects. "What I am about to reveal to you, Miss Vale, has been entrusted to me under the most exacting conditions," he began carefully. 4 years ago, his late Grace, the Duke of Avelgard, made several additions to his will. These additions were accompanied by detailed instructions regarding their disclosure. I was to maintain absolute secrecy until such time as evidence emerged that suggested these materials were required. Elowen's throat constricted. "And what evidence, sir, has emerged?" 3 days ago, Mr. Harrington said, "I received a visit from her ladyship, Lady Brackmore. She came upon the pretext of reviewing estate matters, but her true purpose became evident when she inquired, in rather pointed fashion, whether the late Duke had left any correspondence or documents pertaining to certain relationships that she deemed unseemly. When I declined to discuss the matter, she became rather insistent. She claimed that it was her responsibility, as a senior member of the ducal family, to ensure that nothing detrimental to the family's reputation had been left behind." He paused, allowing this information to settle between them like sediment in still water. "I understood," Mr. Harrington continued, "that the moment had arrived when the late Duke's final wishes must be honored, and those wishes, Miss Vale, were quite explicit regarding you." He opened the leather portfolio with careful precision. Within lay documents, formal legal papers, and beneath them a layer of letters written in that unmistakable hand, Thorne's hand. "His Grace added a codicil to his will," Mr. Harrington said, his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal language, wherein he designated Miss Elowen Vale as a legatee of certain of his personal effects. "These include his private library, a sum of money held in trust, and," he adjusted his spectacles, his expression one of absolute professional neutrality, "these letters, which were to be delivered to you only in the event that you received other communications from him, or in the event that questions arose regarding the legitimacy of your position within the estate." Elowen found that she could not speak. The room seemed to tilt slightly around her, and she was grateful for the solid reality of the chair beneath her. "Furthermore," Mr. Harrington continued, "there is a statement, written and witnessed by 2 individuals of unquestionable character, in which His Grace makes explicit the nature of his regard for you. It is a document that, should it be required, would serve as incontrovertible evidence of the propriety and depth of his feelings. He was, I must say, quite thorough in his legal preparations. He anticipated that his reputation and yours might come under question." "May I?" Elowen gestured toward the letters with a hand that trembled despite her efforts at control. "They are yours, Miss Vale. His Grace wished them to be in your possession. However, I must counsel you regarding their nature. Should these documents become public knowledge, they would substantially alter the narrative that currently exists regarding the late Duke's final years. They would vindicate your position entirely, but they would also provoke precisely the kind of scandal that society so enjoys. The decision of whether to employ them must rest entirely with you." Elowen gathered the letters into her hands. There were 6 of them, each bearing her name in that familiar script. The paper felt warm despite the cold room, as though something of his vitality yet resided within the ink and fibers. "There is one additional matter," Mr. Harrington said quietly. "His Grace provided a separate letter, sealed and marked for my eyes alone, which I was to read in the event that Lady Brackmore made inquiries. That letter has been read. Its contents, I assure you, placed considerable emphasis upon the necessity of protecting your reputation and your position. His Grace was quite adamant that you were not to be made a victim of circumstance or family politics." "What did he say?" Elowen whispered. "I am not at liberty to repeat his precise words," Mr. Harrington replied, "but I can assure you that His Grace made clear his belief in your absolute propriety, your integrity, and the sincerity of his regard. Moreover, he made provision for your financial security should circumstances render your current position untenable. You are, in short, Miss Vale, a woman of independent means. You are no longer dependent upon the goodwill of the estate or the current Duke." As Elowen sat in that cold solicitor's office, holding letters from a man 4 years dead, she understood that the ground beneath her life had fundamentally shifted. She possessed now not merely emotional confirmation of Thorn's love, but legal, witnessed, irrefutable proof. She was no longer a woman of ambiguous status, tolerated by society on the sufferance of the ducal family's generosity. She was a woman of independent standing, a woman who had been loved deliberately, intentionally, and with the precise legal instruments that only a man of power and foresight could command. And yet the greatest revelation was perhaps the simplest. He had thought of her. In the months before his death, in the midst of his final illness, Thorn Avelgard had thought of her welfare, her reputation, her future. He had loved her not with the ephemeral passion of youth, but with the enduring care of a man who understood that true affection must provide for those whom it encompasses. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am grateful for your discretion and your service in this matter. It has been my privilege, Miss Vale. Might I offer you a final word of counsel?" She nodded, awaiting his wisdom. "Secrets," he said carefully, "are the burden of those who keep them. The late Duke chose to entrust you with the truth of his feelings. I would suggest that the time may come, when it serves neither your interests nor his memory, to maintain perpetual silence regarding that truth. Choose your moment with care, but do not allow fear to dictate your entire future." December brought snow to the estates of England, transforming the landscape into something ethereal and clean, a country reborn in white, stripped of all pretense and ornamentation. Elowen had spent the intervening weeks reading Thorn's letters obsessively, committing passages to memory, allowing his words to reshape her understanding of their years together. She had not shared the truth with anyone, not even with Mira, though the girl had begun to notice that her companion seemed simultaneously more serene and more haunted than before. The letters revealed a man in the final months of his life, a man aware, perhaps, that his time was limited, though he had never explicitly stated the fact. He wrote of love as though it were a mathematical proof, laying out the logical progression of his regard for her. He wrote of moments they had shared, conversations in the library, the day he had found her reading beneath the elm tree in the garden, the evening she had helped him catalogue a particularly difficult section of his medieval manuscripts, and he imbued each moment with a significance she had not fully recognized in their living. One letter contained lines that she read so frequently that she had nearly memorized their every word. "I have spent my life in pursuit of power, of consequence, of the respect that comes from command and strength. And yet in your presence, I have discovered that all of these things are as insubstantial as morning mist. What matters, what shall endure, is the recognition in your eyes when you encounter an idea that strikes your mind as beautiful. What matters is the sound of your laughter, which you guard as jealously as a dragon guards gold, and release only when you believe yourself unobserved. What matters is the knowledge that you see me truly, and do not demand that I become other than what I am." On a particularly bitter evening, when frost had etched patterns upon the windows of Ashmore Manor that resembled lace, Elowen made a decision. She could no longer carry this truth alone. The weight of it was becoming insupportable, not burdensome, but rather so intensely significant that silence felt like a betrayal. She summoned Mira to her chamber, knowing that the girl would come without question, trusting her with all the innocence of youth. When Mira arrived, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright with curiosity, Elowen gestured for her to sit upon the small settee before the fire. The girl obeyed, waiting with the patience of one who has learned that her companion does not speak without purpose. "Mira," Elowen began, her voice careful, "I have something to tell you, something that must be held in absolute confidence. I trust you with this knowledge because I believe you to be a person of exceptional moral understanding, and because I believe that His Grace would have wished it." Mira straightened, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Of course, Miss Vale. You may trust me entirely." And so Elowen told her, not with every detail, propriety demanded certain discretions, but with enough honesty that the girl understood the essential truth, that the Duke had loved her, that he had left evidence of that love, and that Elowen now faced a choice regarding what she would do with this knowledge. She showed Mira the wooden tablet, and the girl's eyes widened as she comprehended what she was seeing, permanent marks made by a man who wished his words to endure. "He did love you," Mira said finally, her voice small but certain. "I remember him, you know, not clearly because I was so young, but I remember that he looked at you differently than he looked at others. He looked at you as though you contained something precious." Elowen felt tears prick her eyes, not the quiet tears of solitary grief, but the more profound weeping that comes from being truly seen and understood. "Yes," she whispered, Yes, he did. Then why do you not tell people? Mira asked with the directness of childhood. Why do you not tell Lady Brackmore? She would have to stop being cruel if she knew. It is more complicated than that, dear heart, Elowen said, drawing the girl close. The world does not reward women for being loved by men of power. It punishes them. It suggests impropriety, manipulation, fortune hunting. It renders them objects of scandal and suspicion. But that is unjust, Mira said fiercely. Yes, Elowen agreed. It is profoundly unjust. But injustice is the price society charges for the freedom to love without permission. That night, after Mira had returned to her chamber, Elowen stood at her window, looking out upon the snow-covered garden. The elms stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with white, and she thought of Thorn standing in this same garden during his lifetime, perhaps looking toward her chamber windows, perhaps wondering if she understood what he had never dared to speak aloud. The truth existed now, in letters, in a wooden tablet, in the testimony of a solicitor, in her own heart, and she understood that keeping it hidden forever was a form of betrayal, not of propriety, but of love itself. The spring would come, the snow would melt, and when it did, she would decide whether to remain in silence or to speak the truth that had been granted to her from beyond the grave. The invitation arrived in the form of a perfectly scripted note sealed with the Brackmore crest. It was an invitation to attend a gathering of the local gentry, a social event designed, ostensibly, to raise funds for the parish poor. Elowen understood the true purpose immediately. It was an opportunity for Lady Brackmore to demonstrate, before an assembled audience, precisely how little consequence Miss Elowen Vale truly possessed. The evening was bitterly cold, with a wind that seemed to cut through the very fabric of one's clothing. Elowen dressed with particular care, selecting her best grey gown, no longer the grey of mourning, but the grey of composed dignity. She pinned her hair with the brass pin her father had given her, a small rebellion against the expectation that she should remain utterly unremarkable. The drawing-room at Brackmore House was crowded with the assembled respectability of the county, the vicar and his wife, the magistrate, several families of moderate means and considerable pretension. Lady Brackmore moved among them like a queen, greeting people with the particular warmth she reserved for those of unquestionable standing, and with cool civility those whose position was less secure. When Elowen arrived, the temperature in the room seemed to drop perceptibly. "Miss Vale," Lady Brackmore said, her smile a sculpture of politeness, "how kind of you to join us. I confess I am surprised to see you venture out into society. One would have thought you preferred the solitude of the estate." "Your invitation was gracious," Elowen replied calmly. "I am grateful for the opportunity to support such a worthy cause. Of course, charity is always becoming in women of limited means." Lady Brackmore turned slightly, positioning herself so that those nearby could hear her clearly. "Though I must say, Miss Vale, I have been meaning to speak with you regarding a matter of considerable delicacy. It has come to my attention that certain rumors have been circulating regarding your relationship with my late cousin. Groundless rumors, I am certain, but the sort that can cause considerable damage to a woman's reputation if left unaddressed." The room had become noticeably quieter. Conversations that had been animated now hesitated, and heads turned with the barely concealed interest of those who sensed scandal in the offing. "I cannot imagine what rumors you reference," Elowen said, her voice steady, her hands folded before her with apparent calm. "I was employed by His Grace in a professional capacity. My position is well established and entirely appropriate." "Indeed," Lady Brackmore's smile widened. "Yet it is rather curious, is it not, that a woman of your station should have been granted such extensive privileges, access to his personal library, residence in a cottage upon his estate, the education of his ward. One might almost imagine that his regard for you was less than entirely professional." There was a pause, the kind of pause that exists in the moments before something irreversible occurs. Elowen felt the weight of all the years of silence pressing upon her shoulders. She felt the letters hidden in her chamber, the wooden tablet, the solicitor's witness. She felt Thorn's voice reaching across the boundary between the living and the dead, asking her to claim the truth, and she made her choice. "Your ladyship," Elowen said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "His Grace regarded me with profound respect and genuine affection. He valued my intellect, my integrity, and my character. He demonstrated this regard through acts of deliberate kindness. If you suggest that such regard indicates impropriety, then I can only conclude that you possess a profoundly limited understanding of what constitutes virtue." A sharp intake of breath moved through the assembled guests like wind through wheat. "Moreover," Elowen continued, "I will not permit the memory of a good man to be besmirched by insinuation and gossip. His Grace was a person of honor. His actions were always motivated by principle and compassion. That you seek to diminish the significance of his kindness speaks far more to your own character than to mine." Lady Brackmore's face had turned a mottled shade of purple. "You dare to—" "I dare to speak truth," Elowen interrupted, and the authority in her voice was not that of a woman of uncertain standing, but of one who had been given permission by love itself to claim her place in the world. "His Grace left clear evidence of his regard. He made provision for my future. He ensured my reputation would be protected. He did these things because he was a man of conscience and integrity, and I will not remain silent whilst his memory is perverted by your jealousy and cruelty." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Brackmore opened her mouth, closed it, and turned away, a gesture that any observer would have interpreted as defeat. As Elowen stood amid the assembled guests, her heart thundering in her chest, she understood that she had crossed an irreversible threshold. The truth was no longer hidden. The seed had been planted, and within days, word would spread throughout the county that Miss Elowen Vale had defended her position with remarkable spirit, and that Lady Brackmore's insinuations had been met with dignified refusal. She had spoken. And in speaking, she had finally honored the love that had reached across the boundary of death itself to find her. The aftermath of that evening unfolded with the inevitability of snow melting in spring. Within a fortnight, the story of Elowen's defense had been transmitted through every drawing room, every tea service, and every corner of the county's social apparatus. The narrative, however, had evolved in its transmission. What had begun as a moment of quiet dignity had transformed into something far more compelling. The tale of a woman of modest means, standing against the cruelty of aristocratic presumption. Yet more significantly, the story had reached the ears of those who possessed both influence and conscience. The vicar's wife had spoken to her husband, the magistrate's daughter had confided in her father, and through these intermediaries it became known that a woman of no family, no fortune, and no conventional standing had been loved with deliberate intention by a man of the highest rank. It was Mira who delivered the news that changed everything. She came to Elowen's chamber on a grey morning in late December, her face flushed with excitement and purpose. "There is a gentleman downstairs," the girl announced. "The current Duke of Avelgard. He has come, he says, on a matter of family business. But Miss Vale, his expression is not stern or disapproving. He seems rather determined in a purposeful way." Elowen's hands stilled upon the book she had been reading. The current Duke was Thorne's younger brother, a man she had seen only briefly at the funeral, and with whom she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words in her years at the estate. He was a man of approximately 30 years, with the kind of bearing that marked him as one accustomed to authority, yet there was something in his reputation that suggested a greater openness to unconventional thought than his cousin Lady Brackmore possessed. "Did he state his business?" Elowen asked carefully, rising to her feet. "He asked to speak with you privately," Mira said. "Miss Vale, I believe he has come because of what happened at Lady Brackmore's gathering. I believe he has come because my guardian cared for you, and his brother recognizes that truth." The drawing room at Ashmore Manor seemed suddenly very small when occupied by a man of the current Duke's presence. He stood near the window, examining a landscape painting with apparent interest, though Elowen understood the gesture was merely a courtesy, an effort to allow her a moment to compose herself before he turned to acknowledge her. When he did turn, his expression was grave but not unkind. "Miss Vale," he said, offering a bow that was respectful without being condescending, "I trust I have not imposed upon your time with an unexpected visit." "Your Grace," Elowen replied, curtsying with the precision propriety demanded. "You are welcome at any hour. This is, after all, still very much your property, and I remain in your employ." A shadow of something, perhaps sadness, perhaps understanding, crossed his features. "That is precisely the matter I have come to discuss. Please, sit. What I have to tell you requires a degree of comfort." They settled into chairs positioned at a careful distance, maintaining the proprieties even as the conversation they were about to undertake would challenge every convention that governed such interactions. The current Duke drew from his coat a folded letter, sealed with wax that bore the Avelgard crest. "My brother left instructions," he began, "to be opened in the event of his death. For 4 years I have honored his wishes by maintaining complete discretion regarding certain matters. However, Recent events, specifically the remarkable courage you displayed in confronting Lady Brackmore, have convinced me that the time has come when those instructions must be modified. My brother would have approved. I am in fact quite certain he would have insisted upon it. Elowen's throat constricted. Your Grace, I do not wish to presume. You do not presume, he interrupted gently. You merely exist with integrity and dignity. My brother, he paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the warmth of genuine affection, was not an easy man. He was volatile, unpredictable, difficult, but he was also the finest man I have ever known. He saw the world with a clarity that others lacked, and he acted according to his conscience even when it cost him considerably. The Duke opened the sealed letter, revealing pages written in Thorn's unmistakable hand. This letter contains my brother's final thoughts regarding you, Miss Vale. It is addressed to me, yet it is clearly intended for you to read. I shall leave it with you, and I shall await no explanation or response. What passes between you and my brother's memory is a matter of complete privacy. However, I wish to make clear one thing. The respect my brother felt for you is shared by me. You have shown that respect to be justified, and you shall not be abandoned to the mercy of gossip or circumstance, whilst I yet possess the means to protect you. Elowen reached out with a trembling hand to accept the letter. The paper felt warm, alive with possibility. Furthermore, the Duke continued, rising to his feet, my brother's will contains certain provisions that ensure your financial independence and your secure residence at Ashmore Manor for the duration of your life, should you choose to remain. Lady Brackmore's insinuations have no bearing upon your standing. Your position is legally secured, and you are under my personal protection. I wanted you to hear this from me directly, before gossip or insinuation might suggest otherwise. He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. One final matter, Miss Vale. My brother wrote extensively regarding the nature of his regard for you. The letters I have seen suggest a depth of feeling that was, forgive my directness, quite remarkable. Such love does not diminish with death. If anything, it becomes more pure, more worthy of acknowledgement. He would want you to know that you are cherished, not as a woman who might be vulnerable to scandal, but as a person of inherent worth and excellence. When the Duke had departed, Elowen sat in absolute stillness, holding the letter that connected her to the man she had loved in silence for so many years. Her hands shook as she unfolded the pages and began to read words that Thorn had written, knowing she might never receive them, words that transcended the boundary between life and death with the force of absolute truth. My dearest brother, the letter began, if you are reading these words, then I am gone, and the time has come for truths that propriety concealed whilst I yet drew breath. She read through tears that blurred the words, but which could not diminish their meaning. Thorn had written to his brother of love that was neither selfish nor demanding, but rather a recognition of soulhood, the understanding that there existed in the world a person whose mind, spirit, and character had fundamentally altered the shape of his own existence. And he had asked his brother, in the language of family affection and duty, to ensure that Elowen knew herself to be treasured, to be worthy of the regard she had inspired, and to be protected from a world that too often punished women for the sin of being loved by men of consequence. Outside, the winter wind moved through the bare branches of the elms, and Elowen understood that she was no longer alone in carrying the secret of his love. She was no longer constrained by the necessity of silence. She could now speak openly, could claim the truth of what had passed between them, could allow the world to witness that she had been loved, genuinely, deliberately, eternally, by a man whose memory would endure as long as love itself endured in the world. The announcement appeared in the London Gazette on the second Wednesday of January, a document of legal formality that nonetheless carried the weight of profound personal significance. It was a notice from the estate's solicitors, Mr. Harrington, stating that Miss Elowen Vale had been named as a principal legatee in the will of the late Duke of Avelgard, with specific bequests including his private library, a substantial monetary bequest, and the permanent right of residence at Ashmore Manor. What might have been a dry legal notice became, in the hands of society's most efficient gossips, a revelation that demanded explanation. A woman of no family, no fortune, no conventional standing, had been formally and publicly acknowledged as a person of sufficient significance to warrant the special attention of a nobleman. The speculation was immediate and intense. Within days, Elowen found herself the subject of drawing-room conversation throughout the county, Some whispered that she must have been his natural daughter, a supposition that the timeline made impossible, but which nonetheless took on a certain currency. Others suggested that she had bewitched him, exerting some form of mysterious influence, and still others, perhaps the most perceptive, recognized the simple truth that a man of integrity had loved a woman of worthiness, and that this love had endured beyond the grave. It was the vicar's wife, a woman of considerable good sense, who finally articulated what became the accepted narrative. At a gathering of the parish ladies, she stated plainly, "His Grace was always a man of singular judgment. He did not dispense his regard lightly. If he chose to acknowledge Miss Vale so publicly, it was because he perceived in her those qualities he most valued: intellect, integrity, and genuine kindness. We ought to be grateful that such love existed in the world, rather than suspicious of it." The statement, delivered with the quiet authority of one who had known both the late Duke and Elowen for years, shifted the prevailing sentiment. Elowen found herself no longer the subject of scurrilous insinuation, but rather of genuine respect. Women who had previously regarded her with cool politeness began to seek her companionship. Invitations to social gatherings arrived with increasing frequency, and most significantly she was accepted, not as a dependent upon the charity of the ducal estate, but as a person of legitimate standing and consequence. Yet the greatest recognition came in the form of a public ceremony that Elowen had not anticipated. The current Duke, in consultation with the parish authorities, announced that a memorial service would be held for his brother, not merely a private family affair, but a proper public acknowledgement of the late Duke's legacy and the principles he had embodied. The service was held on a mild day in early spring, when the snow had finally retreated and the first green shoots were beginning to emerge from the earth. The church was crowded with the assembled gentry, the professional classes, and the farming families who had known Thorn Avelgard through his responsible stewardship of the estate. It was the current Duke who delivered the primary eulogy, and he spoke with a brother's intimate knowledge combined with a nobleman's formal dignity. He spoke of Thorn's intellect, his unconventional judgment, his willingness to value persons according to their merit rather than their social position, and then, with deliberate significance, he addressed the matter that propriety had long concealed. "My brother," the current Duke said, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "believed that love, genuine, transformative love, was among the highest of human virtues. He recognized excellence wherever he encountered it, and he honored that excellence by the constancy of his regard. In particular, he recognized in Miss Elowen Vale a person of extraordinary character, and he chose to ensure that his affection for her would endure as a matter of record, beyond the reach of gossip or insinuation." The church had become utterly silent. Every eye turned toward Elowen, who sat with Mira beside her, her composure maintained through sheer force of will. "I have been privileged," the current Duke continued, "to read my brother's private correspondence regarding Miss Vale. I can state with absolute certainty that his regard was honorable, his intentions were pure, and his love was genuine. We, as a family and as a society, should take pride in the fact that such affection existed among us, and we should acknowledge that Miss Vale, through her integrity and her steadfast character, was worthy of that affection in every particular." When the service concluded, and the assembled guests filed from the church, they did so with a fundamentally altered understanding of Elowen's place in the world. She was no longer a woman of ambiguous standing, dependent upon circumstance and the goodwill of her employers. She was a woman who had been loved deliberately, honored publicly, and acknowledged by the very institutions of family and faith that had once seemed arrayed against her. As Elowen emerged into the spring sunlight, she found herself surrounded by women, wives of the magistrate, daughters of country gentlemen, the vicar's wife, all offering their congratulations, their respect, their acknowledgement that a great love had existed and had been validated by those with the standing to make such validation meaningful. Mira squeezed her hand, and Elowen looked down to see in the girl's eyes the reflection of joy and vindication. The child had witnessed the transformation of scandal into acceptance, of whispered cruelty into spoken respect. She had learned that truth, when finally given voice, possessed the power to reshape the world's understanding. And in that moment, standing in the spring sunlight whilst the assembled community offered their recognition, Elowen understood that Thorn's love had accomplished what neither of them could have achieved separately. It had transformed her from a woman of uncertain standing into a person of acknowledged worth. It had taken the force of death itself and the reaching of his love across that final boundary to grant her the freedom to claim her own dignity. The elm trees in the church garden rustled in the spring breeze, and Elowen felt a profound sense of peace settle upon her shoulders, the peace of a truth, finally, completely and irrevocably spoken aloud. By the time summer arrived at Ashmore Manor, the scandal had transformed entirely into something that the county regarded with a kind of romantic approval. The story of a duke who loved a woman beyond death itself, who had left his love as a bequest to endure through legal documentation and heartfelt correspondence, had become the kind of narrative that enhanced rather than diminished the reputation of all involved. Elowen had settled into her new life with the kind of composed grace that came from having finally ceased pretending to be less than she was. She maintained her position as Mira's educator, but now she did so as a woman of independent means, a person of acknowledged standing within the household. The current duke had been generous in his implementation of Thorne's wishes, ensuring that Elowen's rooms were expanded, that her library was enhanced by acquisitions of particular value, and that her place at the estate's table was one of honourable significance. It was on a warm June evening, as Elowen sat in the garden with a book of poetry, Keats, whose melancholic beauty seemed to echo her own experience, that Mira came running toward her with unusual haste. "Miss Vale! Miss Vale!" the girl called out, breathless with excitement and purpose. "You must come at once. There is something in the study, something that has only just been discovered." Elowen set aside her book and rose to follow the girl, her heart quickening with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mira led her through the corridors of the manor until they reached the Duke's private study, a room that had been sealed since his death and had only recently been opened for inventory and cataloguing. The current Duke was present, along with several of the estate's servants, and all of them appeared to be examining something of considerable significance. They stood before the large mahogany desk that had been Thorne's workspace, and upon its surface lay something that made Elowen's breath catch. It was a wooden box, exquisitely carved, with a lid bearing the Avelgard crest inlaid in mother-of-pearl. Upon the top, in letters that had been painstakingly engraved, was a single name, Elowen. "We discovered it quite by accident," the current Duke explained, his expression one of gentle amusement. "During the cataloguing of the study's contents, one of the servants knocked against the desk panel, and this compartment became visible. It appears my brother had constructed a hidden space, specifically for the purpose of storing—" He paused, allowing the significance of the moment to settle. "Whatever he wished to preserve for you alone." With great care, Elowen approached the box. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the inlay, to trace the letters of her own name as Thorne had caused them to be engraved. The wood was warm beneath her fingers, as though it still retained some trace of his deliberate craftsmanship. "Would you like to be alone?" the current Duke asked with remarkable sensitivity. Elowen nodded, unable to speak, and watched as the assembled witnesses withdrew from the study, closing the door behind them with quiet respect. Alone with the box, Elowen sat in the desk chair that had been Thorne's and opened the lid with the reverence one might employ in approaching a sacred artifact. Within lay a collection of items, each one carefully chosen, each one carrying profound significance. There were sketches of the garden made by Thorne's own hand. There were passages from books he had read, marked and annotated with marginal notes that seemed to speak directly to her. There were pressed flowers, the tiny wild roses that grew along the garden path where Elowen had often walked, flowers that Thorne must have collected and preserved over months, perhaps years. And there was a letter, sealed but not sealed, waiting to be read. "My dearest Elowen, if you have found this box, then perhaps the time has come when you no longer feel the necessity of keeping my love a secret. Perhaps the world has been sufficiently kind as to permit truth to be spoken aloud. Or perhaps you have simply decided that the time for silence has ended, and that your own dignity demands the claiming of what is rightfully yours. I have spent years accumulating these small treasures, moments of you, pieces of our shared world, evidence of the reality of what I felt and feel. I leave them to you not as a testament to my love, but as a testament to yours. For it was your acceptance of my regard that gave my love shape and substance. It was your willingness to see me truly that permitted me to become in your presence the man I wished to be. The world has been cruel to women like you, women whose worth cannot be measured in dowry or family connection, but only in the integrity of their souls. I have attempted, through whatever means lay within my power, to ensure that your worth would be recognized and honored. But the greatest gift I can leave you is not legal security or financial independence. It is the knowledge that you are loved, completely, sincerely, and in full recognition of your excellence. Claim your place in the world, my dearest. Do not shrink from truth. Do not permit modesty to diminish what you have accomplished through courage and constancy. You have altered the course of my life, and in so doing, you have made me worthy of the very regard I felt for you. Live well, love fully, and know that somewhere beyond the veil that separates the living from the eternal, I remain, as always, your devoted servant. Thorn Elowen sat holding the letter as the summer light faded from the study windows, as the shadows lengthened across the garden beyond, as the world outside continued in its ordinary way, unaware of the transformation that had occurred in this quiet room. She had been given, by a man beyond death, the permission to claim her own story, the permission to stop hiding, the permission to let the world know that she had been treasured, valued, and loved, with the kind of love that transcends mortality itself. And in that permission, she found the final gift, not love itself, which was already hers, but the freedom to acknowledge it without shame, without fear, without the necessity of eternal silence. Autumn arrived at Ashmore Manor with the kind of beauty that belongs only to English countryside, in the months when summer's exuberance gives way to the mellowing golden light of approaching winter. The trees had begun their transformation, their leaves turning to shades of amber and crimson, and the air carried the particular scent that marks the turning of seasons: rich earth, fallen leaves, the faint promise of frost to come. It was during this season of transformation that Elowen made a decision that surprised no one who had come to know her well. She would catalogue and preserve Thorn's letters, his sketches, and the contents of the wooden box in a manner that would ensure their preservation for posterity, not as secret documents to be hidden away, but as a testament to the reality of their connection, a historical record that future generations might encounter and comprehend. The current Duke, when informed of this intention, had offered his complete support. "My brother would have approved entirely," he said with evident conviction. He was always a man who believed in the preservation of truth, regardless of how inconvenient that truth might be to those who preferred comfortable illusions. Elowen had engaged a binder of remarkable skill, a craftsman from the village who understood the delicate work of preserving historical documents. Together they created a volume of extraordinary beauty. Thorn's letters, bound in leather that had been tooled with a pattern of interlocking elm branches, their leaves rendered in silver leaf that caught the light in ways that seemed almost miraculous. The sketches were mounted with care upon pages of cream-colored paper, and the pressed flowers were preserved beneath layers of protective tissue that allowed them to be observed without the risk of their fragile forms disintegrating. It was a work of love and scholarship combined, a document that transformed private correspondence into a kind of sacred text, a record of how one soul had loved another with absolute sincerity and complete dedication. Mira, now approaching 14 years of age, had become Elowen's chief assistant in this project. The girl possessed her own remarkable talents for scholarly work, and she approached the preservation of Thorn's words and sketches with the reverence of one who understood herself to be engaged in a sacred responsibility. "Do you think people will understand?" Mira asked one afternoon, as they carefully mounted a particularly beautiful sketch, one that depicted the garden as Thorn had seen it, rendered with surprising delicacy for a man whose nature was so fundamentally robust. "Do you think they will comprehend what he felt?" "Some will," Elowen replied thoughtfully. "Others will never fully grasp it because they lack the capacity to imagine love that exists without possession, without the requirement of reciprocation measured in conventional terms. But those who do understand, and their number will perhaps grow with time, will recognize something essential about the nature of genuine affection." It was the vicar who suggested that portions of the collection might be displayed publicly, not in a manner that suggested prurience or sensation-seeking, but in a way that honored both Thorn's memory and the extraordinary nature of what his love had accomplished. A small exhibition was arranged in the village library, a modest presentation that nevertheless drew visitors from across the county and beyond. People came to see the letters, to read the words that a nobleman of consequence had written to a woman of modest standing, and they left with an altered understanding of what love might be. Mothers brought their daughters. Scholars came to examine the breadth of Thorn's intellectual interests, evident in the breadth of his correspondence. Even Lady Brackmore, who had the remarkable ability to reinterpret her own history, came to view the exhibition, and departed without comment, her rigid posture suggesting a recognition that she had been fundamentally wrong in her assessment of the situation. The most profound moment came when a letter arrived from the British Museum, expressing interest in acquiring the collection upon Elowen's death for the purposes of preservation and scholarly study. The curator's letter spoke with evident respect of the historical and emotional significance of the documents and suggested that they represented a unique and valuable record of 19th-century attitudes toward love, gender, and social propriety. When Elowen read this letter aloud to Mira, the girl wept, but they were tears of vindication, tears that acknowledged that the world had finally recognized what the heart had always known, that Thorne's love was not a scandal to be hidden, but a truth to be honored and preserved. As autumn deepened and the leaves fell in earnest, Elowen found herself reflecting upon the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a woman of no standing, dependent upon the goodwill of others, constrained by the necessity of invisibility. Through the vehicle of a dead man's love, she had been transformed into a person of acknowledged worth, a woman whose life had become a kind of testament to the reality of genuine affection. Yet the most remarkable transformation was not external, it was internal, a fundamental shift in how Elowen understood herself. She no longer required the world's validation to know her own worth. The letters had given her that gift, yes, but they had done so by reflecting back to her a truth she had always possessed but had been too afraid to claim, that she was worthy of love, worthy of respect, worthy of taking her place in the world without apology or diminishment. On the evening when the autumn exhibition closed, Elowen stood in the library with Mira beside her, watching as the final visitors departed. The walls, now bare of their precious documents, seemed to echo with the weight of all that had transpired. "What happens now?" Mira asked softly. Elowen considered the question. "Now," she said, "we continue. We live. We love those who are present to be loved. We preserve what is beautiful and true, and we trust that love, genuine, transformative love, will always find a way to endure, regardless of the obstacles placed before it." The girl nodded, understanding perfectly that the greatest love story was not the one that had ended with Thorne's death, but rather the one that continued, transformed, deepened, but absolutely undiminished in the lives of those who had been touched by his affection. Winter came early that year, arriving with a particular harshness that suggested nature itself was conspiring to create a season of profound significance. By December, snow lay thick upon the gardens, and Ashmore Manor had taken on the quality of a refuge, a space of warmth and illumination against the cold darkness that pressed at the windows and doors. It was during this season of renewal and reflection that the current Duke made an announcement that surprised many, but shocked none who had been paying careful attention to the unfolding narrative. He had commissioned a stone memorial to be placed in the chapel adjoining the manor, not a monument to Thorne's death, but rather a testament to his life and to the transformative power of his love. The inscription, carefully chosen, read simply, "Here lies Thorne Avelgard, Duke of these lands. He loved truly, he lived courageously, and he left behind evidence that the greatest power on earth is not conquest or dominion, but the capacity to see another soul and honor it completely." May all who read these words understand that genuine love transcends every boundary, including the ultimate boundary of death itself. Elowen attended the dedication ceremony as a person of acknowledged standing, no longer standing at a respectful distance from the proceedings, but rather positioned with the dignity of someone who had been intimately connected to the man being honored. The vicar conducted the service with genuine emotion, speaking of Thorne's complicated nature, his fierce intelligence, his unexpected tenderness, and his refusal to be diminished by societal expectations regarding how a man of his station ought to behave. And then the current Duke, with visible emotion, offered final remarks. "My brother," he said, his voice carrying through the chapel with the authority of grief and love combined, believed that the world was fundamentally broken by its inability to honor love in its truest forms. He saw people constrained by propriety, by fear, by the rigid structures of society that insisted upon measuring human worth according to standards that had nothing to do with actual character or virtue. The current Duke paused, gathering his composure. He could not change the world whilst he lived, but he left behind him evidence of a better way of being, evidence that one man, through his deliberate choices and the sincerity of his affections, could alter the trajectory of another's life. And that alteration, spreading outward in ripples we cannot yet fully comprehend, may eventually transform the entire structure of how we understand love, worth, and the fundamental dignity of the human soul. He looked directly at Elowen. My brother loved Miss Elowen Vale with a devotion that he wished to see honored and acknowledged. In leaving this memorial, we do more than commemorate his death. We celebrate his life, and we affirm that his love was not shameful, not improper, but rather a testament to his extraordinary character. When the ceremony concluded, Elowen found herself approached by dozens of people, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of genuine respect and a desire to acknowledge what her presence signified. The vicar's wife embraced her with warmth. The magistrate's wife invited her to chair a new committee dedicated to establishing a library for the village poor, a project, she noted, that Elowen could undertake using the financial resources she now possessed. Even the local scholar, who had previously been dismissive of a woman attempting to catalogue historical materials, approached her with an apology and an offer of collaboration. Most significantly, a letter arrived from one of Thorne's old friends, a man of considerable standing in London society. He wrote that he had attended the exhibition, had read Thorne's letters, and had been profoundly moved by the authenticity of the affection they expressed. He wished, he wrote, to commission a portrait of Elowen, not as a woman of romantic interest, but as a person of historical significance whose life had been transformed by genuine love, and whose courage in accepting that love had altered the cultural understanding of what such affection might be. You understand, the painter wrote, that my intention is not to sensationalize your connection to the late Duke, but rather to immortalize your face as the object of one of the most remarkable loves in recent English history. Surely this is not vanity, but rather a kind of historical documentation, a way of ensuring that future generations will be able to look upon the face of the woman who inspired such devotion and recognize in her the qualities that warranted such extraordinary regard. Elowen accepted the commission, though not without some trepidation. When the portrait was finally unveiled, displayed in the Royal Academy's summer exhibition, it attracted considerable attention. The artist had rendered her not as a woman of ethereal beauty, but rather as a person of evident intelligence, quiet strength, and the particular kind of grace that comes from having lived through profound transformations without losing one's fundamental integrity. The portrait hung in the Academy for the entire season, and visitors came from across England to see it, to read the placard that identified her as Miss Elowen Vale, beloved of the late Duke of Avelgard, and to comprehend that there existed in the world women whose worth could not be measured in conventional terms, but only in the depth and sincerity of the love they inspired. By the time winter faded and spring began to approach once more, Elowen had become something she had never anticipated becoming, a figure of significance in the cultural conversations of her time, not famous in the manner of actresses or society hostesses, but rather respected as a symbol, a living testament that genuine love, when expressed with courage and honesty, possessed the power to transform not merely individual lives, but entire cultural understandings. She had been transformed, through Thorne's deliberate love and her own courageous acknowledgement of that love, from a woman of uncertain standing into a woman of undeniable significance, and in that transformation, she had discovered something more valuable than rank or fortune. She had discovered her own worth, reflected back to her through the eyes of a man who had loved her completely and had possessed the courage to leave that love as his legacy to the world. The autumn wind moved through the elm trees as it had moved for centuries, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow seeming to carry within its movement the accumulated memory of all those who had stood beneath these branches and felt their hearts moved by forces beyond rational comprehension. Elowen Vale, now a woman of 35 years, stood in the garden at Ashmore Manor with a serenity that had not been present in her younger self, a peace that came from having claimed not merely her own story, but her own right to exist fully and authentically within the world. The years since Thorne's letter had arrived had been transformative in ways that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. The publication of selected excerpts from his correspondence had become something of a sensation in literary circles, with scholars and poets engaging in serious debate regarding the nature of love as expressed through written language. Universities had begun to study his sketches as historical documents. Literary societies held readings of his most eloquent passages. And, most significantly, his example had inspired countless other individuals to examine their own lives and to question the societal structures that demanded the suppression of genuine emotion in service to propriety. Mira had grown into a remarkable young woman, At 19 years of age, she possessed both intellectual accomplishment and genuine compassion, a combination that Elowen recognized as the direct result of having been loved and valued from childhood. The girl had declined several offers of marriage from respectable gentlemen, preferring instead to pursue her own scholarly interests under Elowen's mentorship. She had published, under a modest pseudonym, a volume of essays examining the role of women in preserving historical memory, and the work had been received with surprising respect in academic circles. The current Duke had married a woman of considerable intelligence and liberal sympathies, and together they had undertaken the modernization of the estate in ways that honored Thorne's memory whilst embracing a more equitable future. Tenants' cottages were being improved, educational opportunities were being expanded, and the estate had become known throughout the region as a place where ability and character were valued above rank and inherited privilege. Yet the most profound transformation had occurred within Elowen herself. She had spent the 5 years since the memorial's dedication engaged in what she could only describe as a kind of spiritual reckoning, an examination of how a single man's love, expressed through carefully chosen words and preserved through deliberate documentation, could alter the trajectory of an entire life. She had come to understand that Thorne's greatest gift had not been financial security or social vindication, though these things were valuable. Rather, his greatest gift had been the permission to stop hiding, to stop diminishing herself in service to the comfort of others. The letters were now housed in a private collection at the estate, carefully preserved, available for scholars and serious students of history to examine, but protected from the casual curiosity that had once threatened them. Elowen had written a series of scholarly notes accompanying the collection, offering context and interpretation that allowed future readers to understand not merely what Thorne had written, but why his words had mattered so profoundly. She had also, in the past year, begun to mentor younger women, those of modest means who possessed intellectual gifts, but lacked the social standing to pursue them openly. Using her own resources and the considerable influence she now possessed, she had helped to place 3 young women as governesses in households where their education would be respected, and had begun a small fund to support female scholars in their studies. On this particular autumn evening, as the light faded toward darkness and the first stars began to emerge in the sky, Elowen stood contemplating the garden that had been so central to her story. The elm trees stood as they had always stood, but they seemed somehow different to her now. Not threatening or melancholic, but rather patient witnesses to human emotion and transformation. She held in her hands the wooden tablet, Thorne's tablet, with his words carved permanently into its surface. She had kept it close for 5 years, had periodically taken it out to remind herself of the permanence of what had been declared. The grooves in the wax had not faded. The words remained indelible, unchanging, eternal. "Do you remember him?" Mira asked, approaching quietly. The girl, the young woman, had grown to understand when Elowen needed companionship and when she needed solitude. Tonight she seemed to understand that quiet presence was required. "Every day," Elowen replied softly. "Though my memory of him now is compounded with something deeper, not the memory of his physical presence, though I have that too, but rather the memory of what his love taught me about myself, that I was worthy, that my mind mattered, that my character had value. These are lessons that die hard, and I suspect they will remain with me for the remainder of my life." "Do you ever regret?" Mira asked. "Do you ever wish that things had been different, that he had lived, and that you might have had the conventional happiness of marriage and children, and all the things society deems necessary for a woman's complete life?" Elowen was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I do regret his death," she said finally. "I regret that we did not have the opportunity to live together, to share daily life, to discover whether the understanding that existed between us in those carefully chosen moments might have endured through the mundane reality of shared existence. But I do not regret what we did have. His love, expressed through letters and sketches and deliberate choices, made with full awareness of their consequences, that love is perhaps deeper than conventional marriage could have produced. It exists untainted by the compromises and adjustments that daily life inevitably requires. It remains pure, intentional, and absolutely true." The young woman nodded, understanding perfectly. She had grown up in the shadow of this love, had witnessed its power to transform shame into acceptance, rumor into historical record. She understood that what Elowen and Thorne had shared was not less than marriage because it had not been sanctified by the church, but perhaps something altogether different, a meeting of souls that transcended conventional categories. "The portrait is being sent to the National Gallery next month," Mira said, changing the subject with the sensitivity that marked her emotional intelligence. "The director wrote that it will be displayed prominently, with a full historical narrative explaining the context of your connection to the late Duke. Your face will be seen by thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people. Does that frighten you?" "Strangely, no," Elowen replied. "I have spent so much of my life trying to be invisible, trying to occupy as little space as possible in the world. The thought that my face, the external manifestation of this woman who was loved and valued, will be seen by strangers, feels like a kind of justice. It feels like claiming my place in the world, not as a woman defined by her connection to a man, but as a person of my own substance and significance." As darkness fell completely, and the stars multiplied in the sky above, Elowen and Mira stood together in the garden, the tablet held between them. And in that moment, suspended between the memory of what had been and the promise of what might yet come, Elowen understood the final gift that Thorn had left her, not merely his love, but the knowledge that love, when genuine and when bravely claimed, possessed the power to endure eternally, not as ghost or memory, but as a living force that continued to shape the world, to inspire others, and to affirm the fundamental worth of every human soul. The letter had arrived 5 years ago, written by a hand long stilled in death, and in its arrival, it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life, transforming her from a woman of uncertain standing into a person of undeniable significance, not because society had finally chosen to acknowledge her worth, but because she had finally chosen to acknowledge it herself. In the narrative of Elowen Vale and Thorn Avelgard, we encounter a truth that defies the rigid structures of propriety and social convention, that genuine love, love untainted by possession, undemanding in its expectations, and courageous in its honesty, possesses a transformative power that extends far beyond the two souls it immediately encompasses. The profound lesson embedded within this story speaks to the fundamental human need to be seen, truly and completely, by another consciousness. Thorn did not love Elowen despite her modest station. He loved her because of who she was, her intellect, her integrity, her capacity for genuine kindness, and in loving her completely, he granted her something that no amount of social advancement or material wealth could provide. He granted her permission to believe herself worthy. Yet the deeper moral extends beyond even this. The story teaches us that truth, when finally spoken aloud, possesses the power to reshape reality itself. What had been whispered as scandal became, through courageous acknowledgement, a testament to the highest human capacity for love and virtue. The lie, that Elowen was unworthy, that her connection to the Duke was improper, was defeated not through arguments or denial, but through the presentation of absolute authenticity. We live in a world that teaches us to minimize ourselves, to diminish our hopes, to accept the limitations that others place upon us. We are taught, particularly if we are women or those of modest means, that our worth is contingent upon external validation, that we must shrink to accommodate the comfort of others, that love expressed across boundaries of class or convention must be hidden to protect reputations. But Elowen and Thorn's story speaks a different truth, that the only love worth having is love that sees you completely, that refuses to be constrained by societal limitation, that possesses the courage to declare itself even when such declaration risks scandal and misunderstanding. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that we ourselves must be willing to claim that love, to acknowledge it openly, and to allow it to reshape not merely our private understanding of ourselves, but our public presence in the world. The letter that arrived 5 years after Thorn's death was not merely a communication of affection. It was an act of profound moral courage, a declaration that truth matters more than propriety, that love matters more than reputation, and that the worth of a human soul cannot be diminished by social circumstance or popular opinion. In claiming the truth of her own worthiness, Elowen did more than transform her own life. She altered the cultural conversation regarding love, propriety, and the fundamental dignity of every human being. She demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the willingness to speak truth, despite the risk of misunderstanding. The eternal lesson is this: never permit the world to convince you that you are less than you are. Never accept the limitations it seeks to place upon your capacity to love or to be loved, and never, under any circumstances, allow fear of scandal or social disapproval to prevent you from claiming the truth of your own heart. Love genuine love, is the most revolutionary force in existence. It crosses boundaries that society has deemed immutable. It sees worth where the world sees only lack. And when expressed with honesty and courage, it possesses the power to transform not merely individual lives, but entire cultural understandings of what human beings are capable of becoming. Dear beloved listeners, thank you for permitting us to share this remarkable story with you. The story of a woman who learned to claim her own worth, and a man whose love transcended even the boundary of death itself. If this story has touched your heart, we invite you to become part of our growing community of Victorian romance enthusiasts. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss a new chapter, a new declaration, a new testament to the power of genuine love and courageous truth-telling. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. What aspect of Elowen's journey resonated most deeply with you? Have you experienced the transformative power of being truly seen and valued by another person? We read every comment and cherish the conversations that emerge from the stories we share. Tell us which themes moved you most. Was it the vindication of love across social boundaries, the power of written words to endure beyond death, the courage it takes to claim our own worth? Your responses help us understand what stories matter most to the hearts of our listeners. Subscribe, comment, and share this story with others who understand that the greatest love stories are not merely about romance, they are about the fundamental human need to be seen, valued, and honored for who we truly are. We are grateful for your presence in our community, for your willingness to invest time and emotion in stories that celebrate the deepest truths of the human heart. On behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we extend our profound gratitude to you for dedicating these hours to the story of Elowen Vale and Thorn Avelgard. In a world that often moves too quickly, that demands constant distraction, that privileges speed over depth, your willingness to sit with a story, to allow it to touch your heart, to permit it to reshape your understanding of love and worth, is an extraordinary gift. We create these stories because we believe that narratives matter. They shape how we understand ourselves, how we relate to others, and what we believe possible within the context of our own lives. Every story we share is crafted with the intention of honoring the complexity of human emotion, the reality of love in all its manifestations, and the transformative power of truth spoken with courage. Thank you for being part of our community. Thank you for allowing us into your homes, your hearts, and your intimate moments of reflection. Thank you for reminding us, through your engagement and your responses, that stories of genuine love, love that persists despite obstacles, that crosses boundaries society deems immutable, that endures beyond conventional limitations, continue to matter profoundly in our world. May the lessons of Elowen's journey remain with you long after these words have faded. May you find the courage to claim your own worth, and may you recognize in your own life the extraordinary power of being truly, completely, and courageously loved. With deep respect and gratitude, the team of Victorian Romance Audio Stories. Where love transcends time, propriety bows to truth, and every heart deserves to be honored.